The morning she signed the paper, her hands weren't shaking. That was the part that surprised her most. How still her hands were, how steady her pen moved across the line, while everything inside her had already come apart. Her father was in the next room. She could hear him coughing. She didn't look up at the man across the table. She didn't need to. She had looked at him once, when she first walked in, and that had been enough to understand what her life was about to become. Tall, quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, the kind that waits. His name was Everett Strome. Hers was June Alcott, and she was 26 years old, and she had just married a man she had never spoken to before today. It had started 3 weeks earlier, the way most disasters do, with something small. A letter. Plain envelope, her father's name typed neatly on the front, which was how June had known it was serious before she even opened it. Her father's friends wrote in handwriting so cramped you needed 2 reads to decipher it. This was not from a friend. The debt was older than she'd known. Her father, Philip Alcott, had borrowed money 8 years ago to keep the farm going after 2 bad harvests. He had borrowed from a man named Bernard Strome, who had since died, and the note had passed to his son. 8 years of interest, a number June had to read 3 times before she believed it. She'd driven out to see the Strome property the week after the letter arrived. Not to confront anyone, she wasn't that foolish. She just needed to understand what she was dealing with. The ranch sat at the edge of the Caribou Plateau, backed up against a ridge of pine and spruce that turned the sky into a narrow strip above it. It was a working operation, real cattle, real fences, the kind of place that had been built with intention over a long time. Not a hobby farm, not inherited money sitting still. She didn't go to the door. She just sat in her truck at the end of the road and looked at it, and then she drove home. 2 days later, Everett Strome came to her. He didn't call ahead. He knocked on the door of the farmhouse on a Tuesday afternoon, and when June opened it, he took off his hat and held it in front of him and said, "Miss Alcott, I think we should talk." She almost didn't let him in. Something in her, the part that had been bracing for this since the letter arrived, wanted to tell him to come back with his lawyer because she wasn't going to have this conversation without one. But her father was asleep in the back room with a fever that had been climbing for 3 days, and there was no money for a lawyer, and she was too tired for performance. She stepped back and let him in. He sat at the kitchen table and she made coffee because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. He waited. He didn't look around the room the way some men do when they're taking stock of a situation. Cataloging what you have, calculating what you're worth. He just sat there with his hat on the table in front of him and waited for her to sit down too. She sat. He said, "I'm not here to take the farm." She said, "Then what?" Quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet, she noticed that. Just the quiet of someone who doesn't speak before they're ready. "I have 2 boys," he said, 8 and 11. Their mother died 4 years ago. I run the ranch, and I have a woman who comes in 3 days a week, but it's not enough. Not really. He paused. The debt is real. I'm not going to tell you it isn't, but there are different ways to settle a thing like this. June looked at him. "You're proposing marriage." "I'm proposing an arrangement," he said. "Which might become a marriage, if it works." She thought about her father coughing in the back room. She thought about the number on the letter. She thought about the 2 boys she'd never met, who had lost their mother, and the man sitting across from her who was offering her a way out that was also, unmistakably, a cage. "What exactly am I agreeing to?" she said. He told her. She would come to the Strome ranch. She would have her own room, her own space. The farm debt would be settled, not erased, but converted, transferred into the arrangement so that her father could keep living on the property without the note hanging over him. In return, she would be present. She would help with the boys. She would be his wife in name, in the community, in the places where it mattered practically. He was not asking for anything she wasn't willing to give. "And if it doesn't work?" she said. "Then we figure out what comes next," he said. "I'm not interested in keeping someone somewhere they don't want to be." She didn't believe him entirely. She believed him enough. She said yes. The drive out to the ranch that first morning was 40 minutes through country she knew well and suddenly felt strange in. Scrub pine and poplar, the road through the valley that dipped and wound before it climbed again. The light flat and pale the way it gets in the Caribou in early spring before the green comes back. She had her 2 bags in the back of her truck, and the knowledge that she had told her father she would be fine, and that she had almost meant it. The boys were standing on the porch when she pulled up. The older one, his name was Fletcher, had his father's stillness. He looked at her with the kind of assessment that shouldn't come on an 11-year-old face, the kind that said he had already decided not to be fooled by anyone again. The younger one, Theo, was looking at her boots. "Nice boots," Theo said. "Thanks," she said. "I like yours too." He looked down at his own feet like he'd forgotten what he was wearing. "These are just regular boots." "I know," she said. "They look like good ones." That was the first real conversation she had at Strom Ranch. It was not with Everett. Thus was not what she'd expected. She didn't know exactly what she had expected. Something colder, maybe, more deliberate, the way she'd imagined the man who owned it. But the kitchen had a window over the sink that looked out at the ridge, and there were drawings stuck to the refrigerator with magnets shaped like fish, and the table had a scratch along one edge that someone had started to sand and then stopped, and none of it felt like a place assembled to impress anyone. Her room was at the end of the hall. Clean, simple, a window that faced east. She stood in it for a moment after Everett set her bags down, and he stood in the doorway, and neither of them said anything. Then he said, "Dinner's at 6. You don't have to cook it," she said. "I don't mind cooking." He nodded once and left her to unpack. The first week was mostly silence and navigation, learning which cupboard held which things, learning the particular sound of the house at night, learning that Theo would appear in the kitchen at 6:30 every morning precisely, while Fletcher slept until he had to be up and came down still half absent, eating his toast standing at the counter before he seemed to fully arrive. She learned that Everett was up before anyone. She learned this not because she heard him, but because the coffee was always already made. She did not try to make herself useful in ways she hadn't been asked. She helped when something needed doing, and she stayed out of the way when it didn't, and she watched. Watching was something she was good at. Her father had always said she saw more than she let on, and he'd meant it as a compliment. What she saw, in those first weeks, was a man who ran a serious operation without making it a performance. The hands who worked the property, 3 of them year-round, 1 seasonal, spoke to Everett the way people speak to someone they've decided is worth listening to. Not fear, something else. There was a young hand named Dale who'd made a mistake with the fence on the lower quarter, and Everett had gone down to look at it. And when he came back in, he'd said to June, who happened to be on the porch, "Dale's going to need another set of hands on that section. Mind if I send him to ask you?" She said she didn't mind. She spent the afternoon helping Dale repair the fence. She didn't know much about fences. Dale showed her what to do, and she did it, and when they finished, Everett looked at the work when he rode past on his way in, and said, "Good," and kept riding. He said it to both of them. That was the kind of man he was. She was starting to understand, the kind who noticed what people did and acknowledged it without making it into a speech. She didn't know yet what to do with that. The problem arrived, as problems tend to, from outside. His name was Lloyd Faber, and he had been a business associate of Bernard Strom, Everett's father. In some capacity June didn't fully understand at first. What she understood was that he arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday morning while Everett was out on the North Quarter, and he spoke to her as though she were staff. "I need to speak with Strom," he said. He didn't introduce himself. "He's not in," she said. "I can tell him you came by. I'll wait." He said it in a way that was not a question. June looked at him. He was a compact man, well dressed for the country, with the manner of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. "You can wait on the porch," she said. "I'll let him know you're here." She found Everett's satellite phone number. They had exchanged numbers the first day practically, and she called him. She said, "A man named Lloyd Faber is at the house. He's waiting on the porch." He didn't ask. "He told me he was waiting. I thought you should know." There was a short silence. "I'm coming in," Everett said. "Don't let him inside." She went back to the porch. Lloyd Faber was still standing, which she suspected was a choice. The kind of man who doesn't sit in a place that isn't his. "He'll be back shortly," she said. Faber looked at her with the particular look of a man recalibrating. "You're the wife." "I'm his wife," she said. "Not the wife. His." He smiled in a way that had nothing friendly in it. "Bernard and I had some unfinished business. I expect Everett knows that." "Then I'm sure he'll want to discuss it with you when he gets here," she said. She went inside. She stood at the kitchen window where she could see the porch without being seen, and she stayed there until she heard Everett's truck coming up the road. She didn't hear what they said to each other. Everett spoke to Faber outside, and then Faber's car was gone, and Everett came in and washed his hands at the sink the way he did when he'd been working, methodically, like he was finishing one thing before starting another. "He has a claim," Everett said, "that goes back to a contract with my father that was never properly settled. He's been quiet about it for a few years. I think he saw an opportunity." "In what?" June said. Everett looked at her. "In the change in the household. He's the kind of man who tests new arrangements." She understood then. Faber had come to see what kind of woman she was. Whether she was the kind who could be used to get at something. "I held him on the porch," she said. "I know," Everett said. "Thank you." It was the first time he'd thanked her for something that wasn't cooking or laundry or school pickups. She found she didn't know what to do with it, so she just nodded and went back to what she'd been doing. The situation with Faber took 3 months to resolve. There were lawyers involved, a trip to Williams Lake, documents June wasn't party to but heard Everett discussing on the phone in the evenings with a careful flatness that told her he was managing something genuinely serious. She didn't ask him about it. She was not his confidant. Not yet, maybe not ever, but she watched the shape of those weeks, the tension in the mornings, and the particular way he sat at the table after the boys were in bed, not reading, not doing anything, just sitting. One night she brought him a cup of tea and sat down across from him without asking if he wanted company. He looked at the tea. Then he looked at her. "He's claiming my father owed him a share of the North Quarter," Everett said. "The documentation is bad on both sides. The lawyer says we can fight it, but it'll take time. Will you win?" "I don't know," he said. "Probably. Maybe." He picked up the cup. "My father was not always careful." She thought about her own father, about the letter, about what it cost, the carelessness of the people who came before you and how long you spent paying for it. "Mine either," she said. Something shifted in his face. Nothing dramatic, just the slight release of a thing held tightly. "No," he said. "I don't suppose that's unusual." They sat there for a while without talking, and it was the first silence between them that didn't feel like distance. Fletcher was the harder one to reach, and she didn't try to reach him. That was the thing she understood about boys like Fletcher. They could smell effort from across a room, and they hated it, because effort meant someone wanted something from you. She just let him be in whatever space he was in, and she was in hers, and sometimes those spaces overlapped. He was doing a history project for school on the Caribou Gold Rush. She found out because she saw the books on the table and asked, without thinking, "Is that for school?" And he said yes without looking up. She sat down at the other end of the table with her own book and read, and after 20 minutes he said, "Did you know that most of the people who made money in the gold rush weren't the miners? The merchants," she said. He looked up. "Yeah. How did you know?" "My grandmother had a book about it," June said. "I read it when I was about your age. She had a lot of books about British Columbia." He looked at her for a moment, the first time he'd looked directly at her without the barrier of assessment between them. "Do you still have it?" he said. She called her father that evening and asked about the book. He found it in the third box she described to him and mailed it. When it arrived, Fletcher took it from her like it was regular, no big deal, no performance of gratitude. And she thought that was the right thing, actually. The right kind of receiving. She called her father every Sunday. He was doing better. The fever had been a respiratory thing that had finally cleared, and the pressure of the debt was lifted enough that he was sleeping again. She could hear it in his voice, a looseness that hadn't been there in years. "How is it?" he'd ask. "It's fine," she'd say. "It's different how?" She didn't know how to answer that in a way that would make sense over the phone, so she just said, "Bigger," and he laughed like he understood, and maybe he did. The moment she understood something had changed came in June, the month. Not herself, though she would think about that coincidence later. The boys had a day off school, and Everett had taken them out to the North Quarter to check on the herd, and June had had the house to herself all morning, which she'd used to bake something she hadn't made since she was a teenager. A rhubarb cake her mother used to make, from rhubarb that grew at the edge of the property in a patch she'd noticed 3 weeks ago and had been thinking about since. They came back in the late afternoon, all 3 of them muddy, and loud in the way they only got when they'd been out together, the boys arguing about something that had clearly already become a story, Everett behind them with the particular look of someone who had been mildly exasperated and didn't entirely mind. Theo smelled the cake before he saw it. He stopped in the kitchen doorway with his boots still on. "What is that?" "Rhubarb cake," she said. "Your boots." He backed up and took them off without being told twice. Fletcher came in behind him and looked at the cake on the counter and said nothing, but he stood closer to it than he needed to. Everett came in last. He looked at the cake. He looked at her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "That's my mother's recipe," he said. She felt the bottom drop out of something. "I didn't know. I found the rhubarb patch, and I always made it. My mother made it. I didn't know," he said, and his voice was careful. It's not a bad thing." He looked at the cake again. "She planted that rhubarb 20 years ago. The kitchen was very quiet. We cannot eat it," she said, which was a ridiculous thing to say, but she didn't know what else to offer. "Theo," Everett said, without taking his eyes off the cake, "go wash your hands." Theo went. Fletcher followed without being asked, which June noticed. When it was just the two of them, Everett said, "It's good that it got used. She would have thought so too." He said it like a fact, not a comfort. Like a man who had learned the difference. They ate it after dinner. All four of them at the table, the boys arguing about something else now. Everett drinking his coffee, the sun going long and orange through the kitchen window. June ate a piece of her mother's recipe made from another woman's rhubarb in a house that was not hers, and felt, strangely, like she was somewhere she could stay. The matter with Lloyd Faber was settled in August. Everett came home from Williams Lake with the look of a man who has put something down that he's been carrying too long, not happy exactly, more like leveled out, like pressure released. He told her the claim had been dismissed. The documentation on Faber's side hadn't held up. She said, "Good." He said, "I want you to know, this place is stable now. What you came into, with the uncertainty, that's done." She understood what he was offering. A renegotiation of sorts. A chance to look at what they'd built in these months with clearer eyes. "I know," she said. "You could." He stopped, started again. "If you wanted to revisit the arrangement, now that things are..." She looked at him across the kitchen. This man who left the coffee made and let Dale know she'd done good work on the fence and thanked her without making a production of it, and had 3 months of hard nights and hadn't once asked her to take them on for him. This man whose son had taken a book from her hands like she was just a person, which was the best thing a child could do. "I don't want to revisit it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. "I want to know if the North Quarter rhubarb comes back next spring," she said. "I'd like to see that." Something moved in his face. Not a smile exactly, though it got close. "It comes back every year," he said. "Been doing it since before I can remember." "Good," she said. "Then I'll stay for that." The first time she let herself use the word home, she was driving back from her father's place in the early evening, the road through the valley going amber in the last light, and she was thinking about what to make for dinner, whether Theo had finished his project, whether the fence on the lower quarter had held through the last rain, whether Everett had remembered to take something out of the freezer the way she'd asked. She was thinking about the details of a life, and she was driving toward them. The ridge came into view as the road climbed, dark against the sky, and then the lights of the house below it, kitchen window, porch light, the particular arrangement of it that she'd learned to read the way you learn to read a face. She knew what each light meant. She knew who was in which room. She pulled up and sat in the truck for a moment, the engine idling. Then she turned it off and went inside.